We are fighting a narrative war. So much of the anti-Palestine prejudice that dominates political and media framing comes from a well-calibrated campaign waged by opaque pro-Zionist lobby groups.
I think the narrative shifted because this is the first time that, the world has been forced to witness a live stream genocide. Palestinian dignity has spoken for itself. It doesn't require an advocate.
Is that trade-off worth it at the future of our ummah in this country?
What this trade-off that you're speaking about does is create a religious secularism that ultimately harms us. Our casework went up 500% since October the 7th,
Really?
just because of the level of repression that is taking place.
Yeah.
And of course, it is all racially encoded. It is mostly black and brown people who are suffering the harsher end of all of this.
Dr Asim Qureshi is a human rights lawyer and research director for Cage International. Together with his team, he has diligently uncovered how these organizations operate and how they manage to influence the corridors of power.
My government is selling weapons to the Zionist state. The quadcopter that emits the sounds of women and children screaming so that it lures adults out into the open only to then execute them in the streets, right? That's what's leaving the UK, because we live in a state that is directly connected to the machinery of violence against Palestinians. Have we not understood that the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may come at us before it comes on anyone else?
Dr Asim Qureshi, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the Thinking Muslim.
Well,
it's wonderful to have you with us, Asim, and we've got a really interesting conversation today. And I've been meaning to invite you and onto the podcast for some time. And of course, your organization, Cage International, has been at the forefront of dealing with some of the sort of really acute cases of civil liberty infringements here in the UK and beyond, actually, because you work around the world. And I was commenting over a coffee earlier today with you that I follow you on social media, follow Cage on social media. And it's only recently that I've sort of realized the breadth of your work. And that's really an indictment of myself in a way, because I follow, Muslim groups and activities in the UK, but just the breadth of your work is pretty astounding, alhamdulillah, and that sort of the service you provide the Muslim community. So I want to explore some of that today, but the focus, I suppose, of today's conversation is a report you recently published about a couple of organizations, two Zionist groups in the UK, UK LFI, UK Lawyers for Israel, and a campaign for anti-Semitism. And you argue that these two groups in particular, they distort public discourse on Palestine. So let's talk about these groups, these Zionist groups. Who are they? What do they do? How do they subvert the narrative on Palestine here in the UK?
Jazakallah khair. Yeah, these organizations, they're quite interesting because what you have really in the UK is this constellation of Zionist organizations that operate in different ways. So you've got the Community Services Trust, you've got the Board of Deputies that represents largely the Jewish community, or at least ostensibly claims to represent the Jewish community. Then you have the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, UK Lawyers for Israel. So you've got like a whole group of organizations that, from the outset really try to claim that they are representing the interests of Jewish people living in the UK. That's their predominant focus. At least that's what they claim for themselves. But really, when you start digging through their activities, their connections, what they're really about, ultimately what emerges is this view that these organizations serve one purpose, which is to provide cover for Zionism and for the Zionist state itself. And they do this in a kind of a whole series of different ways, the chief of which really is to weaponize the accusation of anti-Semitism against almost anybody and everybody. Right. So this is something that regularly comes up again and again and again, that, an organization, an individual, a charity, a mosque, are acting in anti-Semitic ways.
Yeah.
And what they do is that they use different regulatory frameworks in order to try and diminish the space of freedom of expression. So that's really how these groups operate. And we chose to focus on UK Lawyers for Israel and the campaign against anti-Semitism. The reason we did that is, well, UK Lawyers for Israel, it's in the name. UK Lawyers for Israel, as opposed to UK Lawyers Against Anti-Semitism. And for the campaign against anti-Semitism, what we wanted to show is that it may say that it's ostensibly working against anti-Semitism, but really, if you start to look at the different types of complaints that they put forward, many of them really focus on defending the Zionist state itself. And it's this conflation between Zionism and the Zionist state with anti-Semitism, which I think produces a lot of violence against those who are trying to critique what Zionism actually is itself.
Tell me about the breadth of these organizations. Like, how impactful are they on civil society, on life, political and social life in Britain?
Well, one of the things that we do in the report is look at the kinds of connections that they have to mainstream politicians. You have we've got the UK Friends of Israel. The Conservative Party has a version, and so does the Labour Party.
Yes.
So at the highest stations and offices of government, whether it's in power or in opposition, you have a very concerted effort in order to provide support for Israel itself.
Right.
Okay, so this is in the form of diplomatic cover, in the form of political cover, economic cover, and of course through the sales of munitions and various forms of weaponry to Israel. So it's multifaceted. And when you look at kind of MPs like Bob Blackman and so on and so forth, you kind of get an understanding that they're not just involved at the level that any government would be with another state.
Yeah.
There is a deeper ideological commitment to ensuring that the Zionist state maintains its presence in the Middle East in the form that it is in right now. Right. And what's interesting, of course, is that no one, not even Hamas, not any of the kind of groups that are operating in the occupied territory, are actually saying anything about Jews at all.
Yeah.
What they're saying is that ultimately what we need is a long-term truce at the very minimum, but really working towards one democratic state for all people. And it's actually that ultimate project that these groups and the political cover that they have are trying to stop from coming into fruition. And, we can talk about it a little bit later maybe, but, we see some of that in the shifting tides right now that are taking place at a media level, at a political level in relation to Zionism. Right now, they're scrambling to protect Zionism from itself. They can see how deranged Zionists have become. And you see this in kind of like this almost like a 180, but it's not. What we see it as is an attempt to rescue Zionism from its own deranged self.
In your report, you suggest that these groups are connected to some very unsavory individuals in Israel, ministers like Smotrich, who I've just heard has been sanctioned by the British state, right? What is it? Explain that, explain those links, those connections between these organizations and some of those individuals in Israel.
So what you have regularly taking place, say, for example, from an organization like UK Lawyers for Israel, are these invitations to settler groups to come and speak on their platform. So the UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust, which is separate to the advocacy element of their organization, will regularly invite individuals, organizations, groups that are connected to Smotrich, that he is the founder of or a patron of or so on and so forth, in order to advocate here in the UK for increased settlements, for the mass expulsion of Palestinian people out of their territories. And this is why we call the report UK's apartheid apologists, because that's what these organizations do. They work specifically in order to maintain the Zionist state in its current racially segregated apartheid form right now. And that's significant because the International Court of Justice last year, it issued an advisory opinion, which explicitly states that Israel, that the Zionist state, is a racially segregated apartheid regime, okay, which carries implications now under international law.
Right.
You cannot, under international law, have relations with an apartheid state. It's completely illegal. In fact, that state should be made into a pariah state completely. And that's why we have chosen these organizations in particular, because what we're saying about them is that the way that they operate is almost as political and legal cover for the Zionist state here in the UK. And the Charity Commission in particular should not be permitting organizations to effectively advocate on behalf of apartheid, which is exactly what Zionism is, as an ideology and as a political practice.
Every year, Muharram returns, a sacred month, a new beginning, a time to remember, to reflect, and to give. We remember the trials of the prophets, the courage of Musa alayhi salam, the unwavering hope in God's mercy. But trials are not just stories of the past. Today, millions face hunger, war, and loss. Mothers pray for food, fathers search for safety, children grow up too fast, just trying to survive. But where there is hardship, there can be hope. And where there is hope, there can be you. This Muharram, give more than charity. Give relief, give healing, give dignity, give hope. Give today. Turn your compassion into hope.
What if, in that previous question, I mentioned today the government has imposed sanctions on these two individuals, two ministers of the Israeli government. Last week or 2 weeks ago, David Lammy, the foreign secretary, did make some very firm statements about Netanyahu and how he felt he had crossed the line, especially in relation to the recent sort of siege of Gaza. What if the sort of response to what you've said is that, if these organizations are so powerful, how can it be that at the highest levels, there is this pushback, albeit very slight pushback, but there is a pushback against Israel? I mean, how would you respond to that?
I would question the extent to which this is a pushback.
Right.
As as I mentioned already, what I believe is taking place is a normalization of Zionism. Right. This is the state. And, for me, I don't really care about how powerful or not powerful the Zionist lobby is, right?
Yeah.
That for me, that's by the by.
Yeah.
The question is, what role is the UK government playing in relation to an ideology and a system that is in terminal crisis, that we can see its end? We can see that something like this cannot and should not exist in the world.
Yeah.
Right. But how is the state, how is the establishment convening in order to protect Zionism from itself? And the way that it does this is by effectively saying, hey, look, this fringe couple of people, Gavir, Smotrich, these guys, Netanyahu, they've got arrest warrants out for them. We're putting them under sanctions. We're doing the right thing. Except the right thing isn't to do that. The right thing is to turn the Zionist state into a pariah state.
Right.
It is to say that, no, apartheid cannot exist in this world. And so we shouldn't take these sanctions as wins. What we should do is take them as, at the very most, a stepping stone to the ultimate goal, which is to push for one democratic state in the region. But the problem is that, unfortunately, some Palestine campaigning that happens here in the UK sees this as the inevitable goal, because they think that Israel is a completely normal state, which of course it's not.
Yeah. Explain that last bit to me, please. Some Palestine campaigning. So what are you referring to there?
I'm referring to many mainstream kind of Palestinian movements and organizations who openly advocate for two-state solution, that openly advocate for normalization with the Palestinian Authority, which has detained itself tens of thousands of Palestinians, that regularly tortures Palestinians, that regularly is involved in a system of normalizing relationship with an apartheid state. Normally, we wouldn't be as bold as to criticize, Palestinians from the decisions that they make. But the Palestinian Authority is a very, very separate entity, right? So I hope you'll find that we'll never criticize the PFLP or any other kind of group, right? That's Palestinians to decide upon. But the PA has to be understood within a system, the structure of Zionist violence itself.
Are
And
they
that's why they're separated.
collaborators?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think this is part of the problem that we have right now. That when we think about the way in which Palestinian political autonomy has developed, it is through this system and this structure. And look, don't get me wrong, I think people like Hussam Zamlot are excellent advocates in many ways for the Palestinian cause. But he's stuck inside an administration which, I think is very, very well recognized now by this stage as being completely complicit in maintaining the lack of Palestinian aspiration for a just future. And that's the point, right? What does justice look like in the world? If we think about, Andy Clarno's got an amazing book called Neoliberal Apartheid. And what he does is that he looks at the post-1994 movement in South Africa and asks the question, how did South Africa post-apartheid become the most unequal society on earth according to the UN? The disparity between the rich and the poor is greater in South Africa than anywhere else. And that's post-apartheid. Okay, that's post-legal segregation in the country. And the reason for that is neoliberalism. And what he does is that he charts that journey of South African desire for political autonomy with what the Palestinians went through post-Oslo, right? And he shows the similarities between the two. And his ultimate call is this, that if you don't want Palestine to turn into Bantustans that reflect exactly what the problems were with South Africa, then you have to learn those lessons and not go down that same route. And the problem with the PA is that, unfortunately, the PA are part of the system and structure of violence. They are not a solution to it.
Back to these organizations, you earlier on talked about the idea of anti-Semitism and how it's weaponized against anyone who criticizes the actions of the Zionist state, the actions of Israel, or questions Zionism, or questions some of the tactics of the Netanyahu government, or even the opposition, or general society, and how they operate and view Palestinians and the lives of Palestinians, right? And you mentioned the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Now, I've heard many times that this is a very problematic definition of anti-Semitism. Can you spell out what is it about IHRA that makes it so troubling when it comes to anti-Semitism?
So I think ultimately, if one was to be very generous, you could say that the actual definition part of itself is trying to achieve a certain thing, which is to deal with hatred that is directed towards Jewish people, even where there is a perception of Jewishness, right? And as Muslims, I think we can understand how, for example, the perception of Muslimness can manifest as Islamophobia. Say, for example, if a Sikh person gets attacked because your white nationalists think that the turban is an Islamic symbol, we would say actually that was a manifestation of Islamophobia. Like I was talking about when Jean-Charles de Menezes was shot 12 times in the back of his head. The police believed he was a Muslim, right? That's an instance of Islamophobia, even though he's a Brazilian man who wasn't a Muslim. So let's put that aside. We can all agree that anti-Jewish animus exists in the world, right? That requires dealing with, that is a form of racism that is significant. The problem with the IHRA definition is that it came alongside it case studies, and those case studies are used in order to help contextualize the definition. And within those case studies is the claim that critique of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism, right? And that is what has been weaponized now by those who advocate for the IHRA definition. And one of the authors of the IHRA definition, he himself in the US said, actually, this has gone too far. We shouldn't be using it in this way. We shouldn't be using this definition in the way that it is right now, specifically because of that point. Now, what we found is that regulatory bodies, especially those who have adopted the IHRA definition, and even at government level, those who are looking to implement it, what they've done is that they've wholly adopted that idea that attacking what is claimed to be a Jewish homeland, okay, the Zionist state, is akin to being anti-Semitic, which of course is a problem because, you know, no one is saying that Jewish people shouldn't be allowed to exist in the world at all.
Yeah.
You know, the problem of anti-Semitism isn't a Muslim problem. It is not a, you know, an Eastern Christian problem. The problem of anti-Semitism is a European problem, one that is rooted very much in the blood purity that stems from the Reconquista, since before then even. You know, it's a very much a problem that was created out of a European imagination of what purity is. And so when we see how this is used now against those who critique Israel, we see this purposeful conflation. Right. And that's why we talk about it being a weaponization. Okay, and that happens through all public bodies, right, whether you're the NHS or in school or in a university, in whatever forum you're in, you'll find that a critique of Israel will be then weaponized against you, especially by these lobby groups, in order to try and have you removed from your position. But we can change that.
Right. Give me some examples of how it's weaponized, how it's used, say, on university campuses or beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, you know, we've seen that calls for, you know, from the river to the sea, as an example, right, which is a call for justice across the entire occupied territory, is labeled as anti-Semitic because they say, oh, this means that they want Jews to be killed and removed. It's a blood libel, so on and so forth. You know, it's like this idea that, you know, somehow it's calling for the mass expulsion of all Jews from the territory, which of course, as I said before, no organization, no resistance movement has called for within the territory itself. So what are they trying to claim here? They're just trying to use it as a means of minimizing the free speech of those who are on campus. And that's just one example of many. But you see, for example, in hospitals regularly, UK Lawyers for Israel and Campaign Against Anti-Semitism will report somebody just for wearing a Palestine lapel and will actually say, post October the 7th, that the wearing of the lapel or the pin or the badge was in a way support for Hamas, right? And they say, and therefore support for the ethnic cleansing of the Jewish people, which is a completely ridiculous notion. Showing your political solidarity for Palestinian freedom, okay, and having that conflated with anti-Semitism, these are two completely separate things to one another, but we see how they are weaponized within the regulatory frameworks.
The British Health Secretary, Wes Streeton, he sent out an advisory maybe a month ago saying to doctors that they shouldn't wear Palestinian pins because, presumably because of this conflation between, you know, solidarity with those who are facing genocide and anti-Semitism. So would that be an instance, an example of how effective, I suppose, these organizations are at you know, transmitting that definition of anti-Semitism to public bodies?
Absolutely, but you know, this is all political, right? Because we know that specifically that when it came to Ukraine, for instance, public bodies were very, very much open in their displays. I remember coming back into the UK from being abroad and seeing at Heathrow like these signs that said, "Have you seen a war crime taking place in Ukraine?" So on and so forth, right? Showing their solidarity, providing pathways for Ukrainians to be rehoused and resettled in the UK. And so we see this again and again. And actually what we did at Cage was that we tried to bring a JR that unfortunately was thrown out by the judge, a judicial review within the courts, which unfortunately wasn't accepted by the courts, but it was a very unique thing that we did. We effectively got parents from across the UK to fill out a questionnaire that asked them about the ways in which Ukraine, Russia was taught in schools as opposed to Israel, Palestine. And the reason we did this is because we wanted to show that the guidance that was being issued by the Department of Education, that you had to provide both sides of the argument in relation to Israel, Palestine, was not the guidance that was being issued in relation to Ukraine and Russia. So why was there one standard for one conflict, but another standard for another conflict, especially when Israel, Palestine, it's actually far more clear that, you know, there is one entity that has used terrorism, has used dispossession, has used ethnic cleansing and genocide to remove an entire population, and the other one, a protracted conflict that has, you know, much more political implications.
Yeah.
So, you know, you know, it's so utterly clear exactly what has been going on this whole time. And I think what our report does is just to help make manifest what I think most people naturally already know.
Yeah.
But it's important that we call it for what it is and that we have an evidence base established for it, but that we also call out these regulatory bodies for the roles that they play in perpetuating the idea that, you know, Israel, critique of Israel is somehow conflated with anti-Semitism.
Do you think the narrative has somewhat shifted since October the 7th, as the actions of this apartheid state has become so evident to ordinary people? I mean, I'm thinking back to a world pre-October the 7th where even referencing Israel as an apartheid state, or saying publicly or in a public setting, say as a teacher or as a doctor, that, you know, what's going on is genocide, would have led to some form of disciplinary sometimes in the workplace. That level of accusation, it does exist, of course, and I'm sure you can give 100 examples of where that still plays out in a very negative way. But general society has come to appreciate just how fascistic this Israeli state is. I mean, is that your perception? Maybe it is worth talking about some of the cases that your organization has a heavy workload of examples of people who have been accused of anti-Semitism and worse. But yeah, just talk me through has that narrative shifted, do you think?
I think the narrative shifted because this is the first time that, you know, the world has been forced to witness a live stream genocide, and the genocide has spoken for itself, and Palestinian dignity has spoken for itself. It doesn't require an advocate. People are seeing for themselves directly when, you know, we see young people with their limbs torn from them, when we see the bombs raining down on residential areas. It doesn't require any process of re-education to convince most people who have a sense of their own fitrah that what they're seeing is wrong. And you see this across the board. You see this with celebrities, you see this with your everyday person, that they're saying, I can't believe what I'm witnessing with my own eyes. But this comes back to the point about how much the establishment is actually fully invested in Zionism itself.
Right.
That Zionism has gone fully deranged, like fully deranged, completely and utterly deranged. But yet they're still not able to back away from their support for this settler colonial apartheid racist regime because of what it represents in the Middle East, because of what it does in the Middle East in terms of keeping the instability in that region. Let's not get confused here. You know, one of the biggest barriers, largest barriers to true autonomy within the Muslim world is the existence of Israel, which is why there is so much investment, you know, as the last colonial outpost. And that's exactly what it is. It is the last vestige of colonization that truly exists in the world. And until we remove that entity, okay, and come to a just and lasting solution for it, it's not possible for us to conceive of what true justice and autonomy for that entire region might look like.
But back to that contradiction, that hypocrisy over Ukrainian support and solidarity in schools and hospitals and in politics and other organizations, and how hostile sometimes people who show solidarity towards Palestine are treated. Like, what accounts for that dysfunction?
That's a much harder question to answer because, you know, some people say it's guilt, it's European guilt that really functions as the main reason. I mean, we have to remind ourselves that the reason why Jewish people required a homeland is because literally the British enacted a piece of legislation that barred Jewish people from entering the UK territory during the Holocaust. Like they systemically denied them entry into the country.
Yeah.
Happy for them to be abused over there, or at least to be shipped off elsewhere. But what you're not doing is you're not coming into the UK, right? This is part of that heritage of anti-Semitism that exists in Europe.
Yeah.
You read Julia Boyd's work, Travelers Through the Third Reich, and you're so well documented how fascistic the entirety of the British establishment actually is. Not just the Brits, but the French and the Dutch and everyone in that region at that time. So it wasn't like ideologically Hitler was a pariah. In fact, mostly they were fascistic in their ideology, if we just think about like the extent of colonization. So some people say it's a throwback to the guilt that they have from that time period. That's the reason why they're still very, very supportive. But I think it's much more to do with the geopolitics of what Israel means to the West in the Middle East. And I think that, you know, your regular commentator on this show, Sami Hamdi, I think he speaks very, very eloquently to that. And I think it's worthwhile revisiting, you know, some of his explanations for this.
Do you think there's a racism there as well? I mean, of course, you know, the Ukrainians are white. The crisis in Russia, Ukraine is in Europe, right? It's affecting Europeans. Palestinians are brown. Palestinians, you know, at least from their perspective, Palestinians possibly don't have that level of humanity that Ukrainians deserve. I mean, do you think that that has a part to play in that disparity of solidarity?
Racism always operates. That's why we call racism structural. Right. It's always in the room, and whatever decision-making, policy-making that takes place. It's why it's so exceptionally hard to bring Palestinian refugees to this country, even to get them like medical treatment. Whereas pathways were opened up to Ukrainians almost immediately. And that's encoded in the whole of society. I remember when the Ukraine conflict started, there was this in Balham in South London, there was a Salvation Army center there that I've driven by thousands of times in my life. Always saw it as a derelict building. Never seen anyone come into it or out of it, ever, pretty much. Maybe one or two people maximum. It's been there for a long time, though. When the Ukraine conflict started, there was a line of white people going all the way down Balham High Street. All the way. Like, I couldn't believe how far it was going on. People with, you know, different blankets and clothing and, you know, different forms of aid that they were dropping off. I'd never seen anything like this in my life. The only time I've ever seen this kind of stuff is, you know, at charity runs that Muslims regularly do for various conflicts around the world and various issues. And so that was, I think, for me, visually the most stark indicator that, oh, wow, okay, there is something going on in the world that the people of this country feel connected to. But the question is, what is it about those people that they feel that connection? And the only thing that I could come to is that this notion of whiteness. That is the cause for them to come out, that they saw themselves in these people that were being attacked by the Russians. But there have been manifold conflicts in the last 20, 30 years for all of the people that were standing in that line to do the same action, to show the same solidarity. But they've never done so. Because when it comes to Muslim lives and genocides that take place, the West always waits until they're complicit for the entire period, and they wait until the end in order to then emerge and say, oh, we need to do something about this now. But once the lives are all gone, look at Bosnia. Not only did they wait until the genocide had really reached its nadir, but they actually imposed the arms embargo that structurally stopped Bosniaks from defending themselves. Right? They were complicit, entirely complicit in the mass murder of Bosniaks. And at the end, they come along and say, you know, we need this to stop now. Kosovo, the same thing. The NATO bombing only takes place after all the lives have gone. And so we see this again. Rwanda, it was the same thing. So they wait until all the lives, the massacres, the atrocities take place, and then they enter. And, you know, Ukraine was different. Almost really from the very beginning, they made it very clear that this is something that we can relate to. It is racially encoded.
I was struck by a few months ago, Prime Minister's questions. The leader of the opposition, who's black, Kemi Badenoch, questioned Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, over allowing a Palestinian family into the country who had used the Ukraine scheme as a loophole to come to the country. And Keir Starmer's response was, "This is an unintended consequence of that scheme. We're going to close it. We're going to shut it down." Do you think the government, David Lammy, who's black, we've got the highest proportion of ethnic minorities in parliament, in government this time round. Do you think that they will suffer from this structural racism that you refer to?
I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by suffer? I think that
Maybe
people
that's the wrong word.
People of color who engage in racist policy making, I think they spiritually suffer. I think that they suffer in manifold ways that does great violence to themselves.
Yeah.
But we also know that there is an entire history of this, that there is an entire history of people of color being instrumentalized in order to validate racist policy making. And it's really interesting. I think we spoke about this before, but the Quran makes this very, very clear. Like the story of Qarun, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Qarun, فَبَغَى عَلَيْهِمْ, that he betrayed his own people. So this is a story that goes back to the Jews themselves, back to Bani Israel. This goes back to them, and Qarun, who uses his position when Musa alayhi salam comes before Fir'aun's court, and he says, free the children of Israel. It's not just Fir'aun and Haman who say, kill the children and enslave the women, but Qarun is mentioned by Allah as one of those who says that. But he's a Jew himself, he's a slave. And he uses his position of authority, being raised up into the court of Fir'aun itself, to say that. But here's the thing, in Surah Ankabut, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changes the order of the names that he gives when he talks about the punishment. Usually he says Fir'aun wa Haman wa Qarun. In Surah Ankabut, he mentions Qarun's name first, as though when he's speaking about the punishment. And that's why we have to think a little bit more carefully about this politics of representation. We spoke about this in the last podcast that we did together, because I think that, we do get into this this pattern, this holding pattern of saying, oh, representation really matters. The fact that we've got, people being represented. Sadiq Khan received a knighthood today, right? And people are going to praise this. And they're going to say, oh, how wonderful a thing it is that he has been knighted as a whatever it is of the British Empire. But what does it get us in terms of justice on this earth? How does it move us forward as an ethical people? Yeah. Forget about politically, how does it move us forward? Politically, we can just say, well, here we go. We've got somebody who's brown-faced in a very high station of office who has normalized a neoliberal economics that does massive amounts of structural violence on the earth, that contributes to the economy of a Zionist regime every single day. If that's the kind of political power that we're looking for, and that kind of representation that we're looking for, then ultimately we're onto a loser. So I don't think, for me, I never paid attention to the skin color of any of these people. I think if a person of color has involved themselves at that level of government and is okay playing a role in normalizing a genocide and contributing to it, and financially contributing to it through the sale of weapons and militarily contributing to it in many different ways, then ultimately that's a problem for them. But our role as those who are watching a live stream genocide taking place is to hold them all to account equally. It doesn't matter if he's black or brown. He is part of a system and a structure of violence. Can
you talk me through some of your casework, some instances of where Muslims, pro-Palestinian activists have effectively been caught out by the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, or just the general clampdown of government and police authorities to make sure that this narrative does not shift?
Let's start with a success story first. Yeah. I think, we're so used to as a community hearing about, cases that go wrong or awry, that it's nice to have a story to tell where it's the opposite end. But we had a client, Maria Hussein, who in November 2023, so this is a couple of months or a month into the genocide taking place, was pictured at one of I think the largest demonstration that took place for Gaza, with a placard that had pictures of Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak as coconuts, with a palm tree behind and coconuts falling down. It was a very clever satirical image that was trying to make the point that politically these people are instrumentalizing their position in order to perpetuate racism, even though they are people of color.
Yeah,
that's what the motif is trying to get across. And it was really interesting when we first started working with Maria. We were trying to encourage her to say that this is mad. We got her a lawyer straight away, Gareth Pearce, so she had the best representation she could possibly get in the UK. And we were just encouraging her, and I would go to the meetings at Gareth's office with Maria and her family. And we were just constantly saying, hey, look, this isn't going to go anywhere. Don't worry about it. She had a police interview, which was a really crazy interview. And I've actually seen the video footage of that interview. The police officer was completely deranged.
Really?
Utterly deranged, saying, what do you know about Palestine? Really being very, very, very aggressive and abusive towards her. And we thought, okay, fine, whatever. She dealt with the police interview. We thought, how is anything going to come of this? And then I think it was almost 6 months later, they charged her with a racially aggravated public order offense. Okay, even though nobody came forward to say that they had felt racially abused by this. So there was no victim in this entire situation. In fact, what you saw was many people praising the poster, a lot of people talking about it, praising the cleverness of the poster. And so again, we're going to this situation where we're like, look, okay, you got charged, but don't worry, we're sure that they're going to drop the case, because it would be mad for the British government to try and argue, or the CPS to argue, that you have been racist and this is a racially aggravated public order offense.
Yeah.
And then the next thing we know, we're actually at trial. So we have organized for Maria, Professor Gus John, Professor Gargi Bhattacharya, and the journalist Peter Oborne as our defense experts, who are giving very, very incisive information to the judge about the nature of racism in the UK, about the role, Peter Oborne's testimony about the role that Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak in particular have played in terms of perpetuating racism in the UK was particularly powerful. He was actually at some stage very, very animated. He was really trying to get across to the judge how significant this is. And ultimately the end was what we hoped it would be, which is it was a success. We won the case. But the level of stress that Maria and her family had to go through, had to endure, and she actually lost her job, unfortunately.
As a teacher?
As a teacher, yeah. I mean, she took, she had an agreed settlement with her school.
Yeah.
But, the reality is that it was actually crazy that she had to go through this entire process. And this was just one of many, many cases that we've dealt with over the years. You had another where a group of students were distributing material about what's going on in Palestine right now, and they got caught up. But they got called up by the university who threatened to expel them. And it's you realize that actually these institutions, they are so risk adverse that they would rather than just using their common sense and asking themselves, well, really, what is the harm that has taken place here? And what is at stake in terms of making sure that there's an environment of free speech? Because of counterterrorism legislation, because of PREVENT, they have been institutionalized into turning everything into an existential threat. So if a student is talking about the resistance, all of a sudden they present an existential threat to society, which is nonsense. People, students have to have the freedom to be able to think through what is going on in the world and not be, force-fed this diet of these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, right? Because that just breeds resentment. And they will find that information inevitably anyway. But what you're doing is you're constructing an environment where that freedom to be intellectually curious is completely diminished. And I've heard this from students so often, so many, like, you know, our casework went up 500% since October the 7th,
Really?
just because of the level of repression that is taking place. It is actually insane what is going on there right now.
And the majority of this casework was students?
It's a mixture. It's
Really?
it's people in the workplace.
Yeah.
It's, you know, those in the NHS. It's students. It's lawyers as well. Even a police officer came to us looking for help because he was a Muslim police officer who's struggling. In fact, my colleague Mazen Beg just gave evidence in his case.
Right.
So, you know,
It went to trial.
it went to trial. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very, very interesting set of circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And of course, it is all racially encoded. It is mostly black and brown people who are suffering the harsh end of all of this. White colleagues are being picked on as well for what they're saying, but it's nowhere near to the same extent.
The Charity Commission, because we know that there are a number of tools that these organizations, these Zionist organizations, use to subdue Palestinian activism, Muslim activism in this country. And for a long time, and I think we may have briefly talked about it previously, but for a long time, the Charity Commission has been a stick to beat Muslim organizations with, in particular, mosques who are subscribed to the charity status and are effectively governed by the Charity Commission. Just explain the sort of the subversive or the sort of malignant approach, I suppose, of the Charity Commission when it comes to Muslim organizations.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is a great question. So the Charity Commission is a regulatory body.
Right.
It is responsible for ensuring that all charities in the UK are abiding by the Charity Commission's guidelines in terms of the purposes of what a charity is trying to achieve, okay, which is generally like trying to do good works and abide by like the Human Rights Act and so on and so forth, okay. Now, what has happened is that because a lot of Muslim institutions want charitable status because they want to receive donations, and with a donation, what you get from the government is 25% paid for by the government on your donation. So if I give £1, 25p extra will come directly from the government.
Wow.
In claiming gift aid, providing you are a UK taxpayer when you give your donation.
Yeah.
So it's not a small amount. You know, if an organization has raised £1 million over the course of the year, they're getting an extra £250,000 from the government on top of what they raised. So you can imagine how invested people are in forming as charities so that they can take that government support, because that's not the only model, by the way. You know, you can also be a company limited by guarantee that works as a charity without having the Charity Commission regulation, but you don't get the 25% then.
And you have to pay VAT and
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You have to pay VAT and you have to do all of that.
Yeah.
Okay. So most organizations decide to do this.
Right.
Now they're under the Charity Commission's regulatory framework. But the regulatory framework also has other policies that are embedded into it, such as the prevent framework, for instance, and frameworks in relationship to anti-Semitism, which includes through the back door the IHRA definition. So now a lot of charities have a problem. A lot of mosques have a problem. They're constituted as charities. Yeah. So in the Khatib, in a post-October the 7th environment, says something along the lines of, it's our duty to support the resistance in Palestine. You know, some entity has watched that khutbah, has issued a complaint to the Charity Commission. The Charity Commission gets in touch with the mosque. The mosque then suspends the Imam pending an investigation, and quite often completely expels the Imam. Now, what does this do? This has a chilling effect, not only on the mosque itself, but also on the Imam who want to be brave, who want to say things that are righteous, that are just, who want to help guide their community towards better positions so that they can become active and useful members of this ummah. But this process inhibits them from doing so because the mosque committee, which, you know, sometimes becomes like a business structure, unfortunately, is worried about, well, if we fall out with the Charity Commission, then what will happen to us? So they take a quietist approach. they effectively say, you know, there's no politics in the mosques. We're not going to talk about any politics except at election time when they'll invite the local MP to come in and speak from the minbar. But other than that, you know, it just shuts down debate entirely. So this is the problem with the Muslim community's relationship with the Charity Commission. Now, that's not across the board, by the way. Yeah. So there are some exceptions to this, like Lewisham Islamic Center, for instance, who, mashallah, I think is a beacon mosque where they fully advocate for Palestinian liberation. They fully advocate against injustices all over the world, both domestically and internationally. And whenever they have complaints issued against them, robustly deal with those complaints, centering their ethics as Muslims over the spuriousness and vexatious nature of the complaints against them. So I think they're a really fantastic example of how actually you can be brave and you can stand up for yourself and you can say that actually everything that we're doing is completely within Charity Commission's guidelines. But unfortunately, most people, most community organizations, most mosques don't take that approach, which is why they end up limiting the space themselves of what Islam looks like in public life because they don't know how to handle these complaints.
How problematic is this? I mean, it is problematic, of course, but just, you know, I would imagine some mosques weigh up the goodness they can achieve in their communities, you know, youth programs, you know, mothers, and, you know, having nurseries and of course prayer and organizing the prayer versus speaking up on issues to do with Gaza and Palestine. And, you know, of course, we've been to masjids across the UK where, you know, a khutbah is given on some, sorry to put it in this way, but an inane topic. If it's not covering, you know, the most consequential event of our generation, probably, which is genocide, but it's repeated week after week after week, and the Musallis are content with that because, in a sense, we've implicitly made that trade-off that there are some places where we can't talk so openly about Palestine. I suppose I'm asking you, like, is that trade-off worth it when it comes to the future of our ummah in this country?
I think what this trade-off that you're speaking about does is create a religious secularism that ultimately harms us.
Yeah.
We then create these disparate spaces. So the space of religion happens inside the mosque and the space of politics happens outside of the mosque.
Yeah.
Whereas as Muslims, we're supposed to understand the deen as something that is holistic. So if we are being forced to watch the live murder of Muslims on a daily basis, and we're being told at the same time, well, there's nothing you can do about it, so it's better that you just focus on maintaining your local Muslim scouts group, but not imbuing that scouts group with the connection and the dedication and the love and the concern for what's happening in Gaza, then you've automatically created these disparate spaces then. These disparate spaces that are not supposed to exist. The world is intimately connected to our spirit. And, you know, if we think about it in these terms, the Zionist entity exists in the Middle East, right? It's surrounded by Muslim countries who are, they're not apathetic, they're complicit, right? Jordan is complicit. And maintains the jailing of Palestinians. Egypt is complicit and maintains the jailing of Palestinians. People are calling on the Egyptian army to do something. The Egyptian army is already there. They're standing at Rafah, except that they're taking tens of thousands of dollars of bribes in order to let Palestinians through. That's the role they're playing right now as we speak, right? So what is our relationship? That's what we have to ask ourselves. We can't wait for other people all the time. We have to just ask ourselves, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created a scenario where I was born in the UK, I was raised in the UK or naturalized here, whatever status you have. But I know right here, right now, that my government provides diplomatic and political cover to the Zionist state. That my government is selling weapons to the Zionist state, that is allowing for private companies like Elbit Systems to sell weapons to the Zionist state. Those factories are producing drones and quadcopters that are going into Gaza and killing men, women, and children. the quadcopter that emits the sounds of women and children screaming so that it lures adults out into the open only to then execute them in the streets, right? That's what's leaving the UK, right? So then we have to ask ourselves as mosques, as Muslim organizations, well, we live in the UK, that's happening in the UK. What's our relationship spiritually to that connectivity? Yeah. Because we, as British Muslims or as American Muslims, as Western Muslims, are closer to what's happening in Israel in many ways because of the structure of power and the way that power works in this earth than the vast majority of Muslims on this earth.
Right.
Like, what do we honestly believe that you and me, as people born or raised in the UK, that we have less of a responsibility than a fisherman off the coast of Somalia or a farmer in Afghanistan? Have we not understood that the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may come at us before it comes on anyone else? And if we genuinely believe that's not the case, then I think we're fooling ourselves, because we live in a state that is directly connected to the machinery of violence against Palestinians. So we are, as taxpayers, we are implicated by our very presence here. And so are our mosques, and so are our organizations. And so these institutions have to ask themselves very, very seriously, what does it look like to stand before the Palestinians of Yawm al-Qiyamah and to see their fingers pointing at us? Because I would hope that inshallah, if that happens, that they're pointing at us to say that, oh Allah, they were the ones who protected us. They were the ones who worked for us, rather than pointing their fingers in blame, because that would be a very dangerous position to be in.
Dr. Asim, you wrote an article a few months back. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is the right word, but you were criticizing imams and scholars in this country, and I suppose across the Western world, for their silence sometimes. And I think it struck me that it was, you were very firm in that article. You almost expressed the sort of idea that they're being complicit in this genocide for their silence. Now, we know that there are a number of scholars in this country who maintain a very high profile, who give conferences, who sell out tickets at, Excel Center and beyond, who say very little about Gaza. I mean, what is the value? Maybe that's, again, the wrong term, and I'm trying to sort of pick the right words here. What is the value, I suppose, of the Islam that's been taught if it's devoid of justice?
I mean, that was the entire purpose of the article, which was to question that very thing. Yeah. We talk about having a platform and what it means to have a platform. Like you've made it. You've reached the apogee of social media fame. You've got 10 million followers potentially on Instagram or Twitter or whatever, or X, whatever it's called. And you get to that point, and then you have to start making considerations. All right? What if I say the wrong thing? What happens to me? Now, the Islam that I was taught, and the reason why I wrote, maybe not in critique, but as inshallah, as a form of advice to myself and to these ulama, is, I was taught to respect our ulama. That our ulama, they literally wear the mantle of the prophets. And I don't know a single example of a prophet in the Quran that we were told about who said to his people, you guys go ahead and fight. You guys go ahead and command the good and forbid the evil. And what I'll do is I'll stay back and I'll teach the people, right? Now, we are taught that in times of jihad, there should always be a group that remain behind to teach the people. But what happens when that group is like literally all of them, or the vast majority of them, and actually the ones who are going forward are so few that between you and I, we can probably count them between our fingers, right? That's a problematic situation. And when I speak to them, they say, oh, brother, how will our dawah survive? How will the people learn? And my response is always the same, that you are the ones that have taught me that this religion does not rise and fall off a single person. That do you think that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance is to reach a person, that you are the sabab, that you are the cause for that? Or that we know that that guidance will reach that person regardless of your position and presence? And I think this is a conceit that many Muslim organizations in the UK have unhelpfully learnt about themselves. That sometimes they have gotten into this trap of believing that without them, the work that they're doing won't succeed. And I think that that is a conceit that is actually contrary to the ethics and the virtues of our faith. That we should actually embody this idea that speaking the truth carries its own barakah, and that it carries its own protection from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And, you know, not to say that Cage doesn't make mistakes. Like, we are like any other organization. We will, and, you know, we will always admit to where we believe that we've gone wrong somewhere. But I think one of the things that does separate Cage from so many other organizations is that we think about our ethics first and what our position is in relation to the oppressed. And regardless of the consequences, we center that before all else. We don't think about, like, for example, when we criticize Saudi Arabia publicly, you know, people told us that you might not be able to perform Hajj or Umrah again.
So many of my guests tell me that. Yeah.
And quite frankly, what would be the point of that Hajj and Umrah if we abandoned somebody who's being tortured so close to the Prophet's mosque they could see the minar of the Prophet's mosque in a secret prison? And that's what we're being told. And we have a choice. Either we expose the member of the royal family who's carrying out the torture himself by name, or we keep it to ourselves in the hope that we can perform the Hajj and the Umrah and perform these acts of ibadat that are, of course, personal to us, and they don't benefit anybody else except for ourselves, right? And so this is the question, right? And it just ultimately it comes down to a question that I think that our scholars have to ask ourselves. What is the value of the knowledge that they have? What is the value of the positions that they have? If you have 10 million followers on social media and you can't even name the entity, the Zionists that are murdering Palestinians, you've gone almost 2 years without taking that entity's name. What is the value of that platform that you have? And if it's just to encourage people towards the deen, then I promise you, brother, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will encourage those people regardless of whether or not you exist in the world.
Do you subscribe to Sheikh Ali Hamouda sent out a message where he said if a scholar today is not talking about Gaza, then it disqualifies that scholar when it comes to talking about Islam. Don't listen to that scholar on any issue of Islam if they're not talking about Gaza.
I mean, Sheikh Ali Hamouda is one of the people that I love and respect in the UK. And so I very much agree with that position. Just at a personal level, let's take Islam out of it in the sense of, just as a human being and as a man, right? If I knew that somebody had acquired so much knowledge, they'd memorized books and whatever else, right? That they weren't applying that to one of the most important issues that we have been forced to contend with day in, day out.
Yeah.
Literally to witness the tearing off of limbs of children, and to not use that knowledge for the sake of speaking out against it, just at a very human level, I would just have no respect for that person whatsoever. Like none. I just wouldn't be able to look that person in the eye and think of them as a decent human being or as a man. Forget about the religious implication, the spiritual implication of them not doing so.
Yeah.
Like, I just wouldn't want that person in my life because I would find them weak and pathetic.
Yeah.
And I don't know how people, I get to do this work day in, day out. I get to work with Palestinians, get to try and represent Palestinians and their cause. And it's such a blessed position to be in. And I feel constantly like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment hangs over my neck. And I don't know how other people who have the ability, who have the resources, who have the knowledge, are not utilizing it and doing whatever they can for the same cause. Because, people can't hide behind the excuse of, oh, well, we're doing stuff behind the scenes. brother, we know everything that's going on in terms of the Palestinian cause. There is nothing you can do in private that hasn't already been tried in the past, that hasn't already been expressed, that hasn't already been done. What we're looking for is leadership right now when we're seeing so much innovative work going on out there in the world. Where are you in relation to it?
Yeah. Today you lodged an application to the Home Secretary to de-proscribe Hamas as an organization, and that follows a couple of weeks back, or a month back maybe, Riverway's solicitors, a lawyers firm here in the UK, Fahad Ansari, of course, who lodged a very similar application to de-proscribe Hamas as an organization that's on the terrorist list in the UK. So explain that to me. Like, why did you feel the need, did Cage feel the need to do that?
So let me just go through the law quickly first, because I think it's important. In the UK, we have Section 12 of the Terrorism Act, which makes it an offence to express, to support or to express support for a banned terrorist organization, what's known as a proscribed organization.
Right.
So nothing that I say or nothing that we have done with the legal case should be taken as support or an expression of support for Harakat al-Muqawwama al-Islamiyya, or Hamas, or the Islamic Resistance Movement, as it's known in English. So with that said, Cage wasn't involved in the Riverway Law application except in two ways. Well, Cage wasn't. I was personally involved as the person who led on the research. So the application itself that was drafted by Fahad Ansari, Frank McGuinness, and Daniel Gruters is about 100 pages long, and it includes testimony from Dr. Musa Abba Marzouk, who is one of the political heads of Hamas, in relation to all the reasons why Hamas should be removed from the list of banned organizations. It's a very well thought through document. It's very clear on the international law. It makes it very clear that not only does Britain have a responsibility to not support the Zionist state, but actually going further to say that really Britain has a responsibility to support the resistance against Zionism and settler colonialism. That's the actual correct international position. And that application is very, very sure that it should succeed. The Home Secretary should read the 100 pages of the application and the 700 pages of addended expert reports from people like John Dugard, who's the South African judge, Avi Schleim, the Oxford professor, and many others, right? Who are all making the argument of why Hamas should not be on the list of proscribed organizations. So that was the application a month ago. That was submitted. Now, from a Cage perspective, so that application, my personal capacity with the application, was directly issued by the leadership of Hamas themselves. So they have applied through the legal team to the British Home Secretary.
Yeah.
Cage had a report in that in relation to some of our cases, but it's a very, very small thing. We decided at Cage that actually, because we've had so many cases come into our organization where people have been affected by Section 12 of the Terrorism Act, or through regulatory bodies due to this accusation of Hamas, that we should actually highlight the extent to which the proscription regime in the UK has an implication for freedom of expression and democracy itself. Now, you can imagine a bizarre situation in which you have a Palestinian. Let's imagine that next month there's elections, right? Somehow there's a ceasefire and everybody agrees we should hold Palestine elections all over again.
Right.
Hamas runs as an elected body. It wants to run in the elections. It does so. You have in the UK somebody who's a British national or somebody living in the UK, but wants to do a postal vote and wants to issue their vote for Hamas.
Yeah.
Technically, that would be a terrorism offense under the current regime, right? So I just want to give you like this bizarre scenario as an understanding of the extent to which this proscription regime inhibits one of the main parties in Gaza and in Palestine, across Palestine, from actually being able to operate in the world. The prescription regime is a political regime.
Right.
It's an entirely political construct. You know, from all the evidence that we've presented, Hamas presents no existential threat to the UK. Or anyone in the West. They have only operated within the occupied territory itself. So people who are interested in what's going on in the Middle East, if they're talking about the resistance that's been taking place historically and now within Palestine, you kind of have to talk about the Islamic resistance movement. It's almost like you can't talk about it. And unfortunately, what's happened is that those who have been speaking about it have found themselves falling foul of terrorism laws or a pseudo form of the terrorism laws. So this is where it gets interesting, right? Because some people have been charged for expressing support for Hamas, but actually the vast majority of the cases we show are all regulatory body cases.
Right.
So either it's a criminal offense or it's not. Why are regulatory bodies picking on this and effectively running with it within their own frameworks, right? If the regulatory body thought that a doctor had breached Section 12 of the Terrorism Act, surely they should have just submitted the complaint directly to the police and let the police deal with it as a matter of criminal law. But they're not. As this application to de-prescribe shows, what we see is actually that regulatory bodies or schools or governing bodies are effectively acting as pseudo-policemen themselves, right? On an issue that ultimately is very political. And as Dr. Sophie Haspesler writes in her book, Prescribing Peace, all of this is political, that every single conflict in the world where you have a group that is labeled a proscribed terrorist organization, that always the West will talk to that group. It is inevitable. It has been the history of the world. It is always the case. Things change. We see with HTS in Syria right now that you have got Western governments bending over backwards in order to talk to Ahmed al-Shara, which we would say is the correct position. But why did it take you so long to get there? Why did you have to diminish Syrian resistance for so long and prescribe it and create this environment in which people were being criminalized all over the place, when actually what could have happened is that process could have been sped up much sooner. So, in the case of Hamas, we believe that it's inevitable that at some point the British government will have to talk to them. But the question is when, right? And what we're trying to do is trying to say, don't wait until that point in the middle of a genocide, right? You have the opportunity as the British government to understand what the implications are. We are presenting those findings to you. It is better that you de-proscribe now and allow for pathways of peace, allow for that environment to emerge where people can have honest conversations about what is going on, rather than criminalizing the space of legitimate discussion.
It's going to fail, isn't it, Asim? I mean, you're lodging that application to the Labour government. Yvette Cooper's a Home Secretary. The Labour Party is a Zionist party through and through. It supports Israel. It has given diplomatic and political cover to the state of Israel where politically possible, and it continues to do so. Some would say it's a fool's errand. Like, why even try what was never going to come to fruition? They're not at this stage ready to de-prescribe Hamas as an organization.
Well, for a start, I think that the arguments are very strong. That if Yvette Cooper comes back and gives reasons why, we're going to learn a lot about the British government itself.
So she has to respond.
She has to respond.
Right.
Now, she may choose not to give reasons. Okay, even though she should, which then takes us to the Prescribed Organizations Appeals Commission, right, which is POAC. It's a court that we can then appeal to, which is a judge-led court. We were able to present our arguments there.
Right.
And unfortunately, sometimes in POAC, what the government do is they'll claim public interest, and they will ask the judge to go behind closed doors in order to present their evidence against the case that we're making. And in that circumstance, neither we nor our lawyers will be permitted to see the evidence that the government is presenting. What they do in that circumstance is that they appoint a court special advocate who can speak to us as the appealing team prior to the proceedings starting. But once that special advocate hears the government's evidence, they cannot confer with us at all. We have to rely upon them behind closed doors to advocate on our behalf without knowing exactly what's going on
this
inside.
This is an individual that the government appoints.
Well, there's a pool of special advocates.
Okay.
So it would be somebody from that pool, effectively.
Okay.
And there's some fairly decent lawyers in that group. Right. So hopefully we'll find the right person if it gets to that stage. But tawakkal ala Allah. Let's see if Yvette Cooper changes her mind and decides to do the right thing and be on the right side of history as opposed to being on the genocidal side of history, which they already are on.
Yeah.
But then, of course, there are layers of appeals, and I think we're confident that we'd want to take this all the way to the European Court of Human Rights and ensure that we follow, because, like anything else, we can only do the things that we have been trained to do and to use them to the maximum efficacy that we can. We believe that this application is the quickest way to help reduce the tensions in the Middle East by opening up our corridors to actual negotiation and discussion, by exposing Zionism for what it actually is, by getting the British government to admit that Zionism is an evil racist ideology and that resistance is perfectly legitimate under international law. So we've assessed the legal landscape, and in our assessment, we believe that this is the fastest route in order to achieve that goal. Now, it's probably going to be a bit bumpy along the way, but we have to try that, because that is the burden that people like Riverway Law and ourselves at Cage and whoever is bringing these types of application, that's the responsibility on us. We're not Islamic scholars, right? Our duty is not to stand on the minbar and teach the people about how they should be involved in Gaza. Our job is to use our legal training and our political training in order to use the tools we have in front of us in order to affect that change. And we're responsible to Allah, before Allah, for using those skills in the right way, right? So right now, in our assessment, this is one of the best things that we can do. And of course, it is in a panoply of actions. We don't put all of our eggs in one basket. This is just one action that we have taken, an important one, a significant one which we believe turns the table upside down, because most people are arguing out there that, maybe Hamas shouldn't be considered a terrorist organization. Actually, what we're interested in is Zionism itself. This is why we're attacking the lobby groups. Why are we always on the defensive? At Cage, yes, we're representing lots of different people saying, we have to help this person, we have to help this person. But actually what we need to be doing is attacking the source of the complaints themselves. Why are we only dealing with the after effect? So if we know that UK Lawyers for Israel and Campaign Against Anti-Semitism are issuing these vexatious complaints to these regulatory bodies, what we need to be doing is explaining to those regulatory bodies why you should not be listening to these rabid Zionists in the first place. That's really the work that needs to be done, cutting off the source of the complaint itself. Like, how can you take seriously these complaints from this organization that believes in X, Y, and Z? So it's always multifaceted. But, the best work is the work that is in offense, never the work that is in defense. Because the defensive work is something that we have to do because we're obligated to help those who are in need. But if we want to bring about change, we have to change the system and the structure that is embedded at the level of the establishment, which, of course, we understand is Zionism itself.
This has been a really fascinating conversation. Can I move to a conversation we had off camera, which I found extremely fascinating, and it was about your children now coming of age. They're teenagers, and as a father, especially I think a lot of Muslims across the country and beyond are thinking about this. We're trying to politically educate our children. We want them to be activists. We want them to imbue their Islam into their sense of justice. We want that for our children. And you were saying that you've sort of embarked on this journey with your kids to inform them about the world. Now, just talk us through that. Like, how are you doing that, and how do you prevent? Because there's a lot of horribleness in the world, right? You know, and of course we do as parents want to shield our children from, especially at a very younger age, but shield our children from, you know, what's happening in the world. Some of the images we see of Gaza, we find trouble in. We find it very difficult to look at those images. So just talk me through that sort of political education that journey that you're embarking on.
No, Jazakallah khair. I think there's lots of things that, I mean, you know, subhanAllah, being, you know what it's like, being a parent is a huge burden. And you always feel like you're getting it wrong 99% of the time.
Yes.
You know, and I always joke with people and saying that, you know, the best decision we made in terms of child rearing was to reduce my role with the kids and make sure that the wife did most of it. But I mean, it's jokes aside, you know, it's tough. It's tough. And especially when we do this type of work, when, you know, I'm coming home and from like maybe an investigation trip where I've had a mother and her son describe being held in a Moroccan prison where the son was trained by the torturers to like hate his mother to the extent that he almost killed her in her cell one night when he was 10 years old, right? Wow. This is my world.
Yeah.
And I'm like doing these interviews, these trauma interviews, and I'm coming home, and sometimes the last thing you want to do is talk about work when you get home.
Yeah.
But it stays with you, right? So like, I think, you know, my wife definitely knows, my kids would know when, you know, I was in a space that was a little bit more quiet, because it affects you, like doing this type of work. You can't be around the stories and the lives of those who've been tortured and traumatized in so many different ways without it being present in your daily life. And you're right that what we do when the children are younger is to try and shield them from a lot of this as well, to like make sure that you're not talking about the, you know, any cases. Obviously, you know, crime privilege does remain even at home, but that you're not kind of bringing your home work back in a way that kind of harms them. But at some stage, they have questions. What do you do for a living? Right? Like, what is this that you're doing? What's going on? You know, they're watching the same things that you are during Ramadan. And, you know, Palestine, for some reason, an issue that always comes up in Ramadan. You take them on protests when they're from a very, very young age. So they like learn to shout from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, before they even really understand where Palestine is in the world. You know, they're going in there, pushing them along in their prams and whatever else with everyone else.
Yeah.
So that education happens in some ways when they're younger by osmosis. It's happening constantly. You're talking to your spouse, to your siblings, to your parents about what's happening, and the kids are always picking stuff up. You know, they're sponges. And then one day one will have a conversation. You've maybe been a bit negligent about an issue that you've been talking about in the world, and they'll be like, "Oh, you were speaking about this one day," and then you realize, "Oh, damn! Like my kids actually like they're listening." You have this moment of realization where you know that, oh, they're picking this stuff up and they have questions relating to it.
Yeah.
So it was just a case of trying to think about how do you develop that instinct that they have of being curious about the world and understanding how the world operates itself. And there's so many tools I found that you can actually use to do this. From an Islamic perspective, we found that the sharing of talks by like Imam Sulaiman, for instance, is a really incredible entry point for our children into to understanding the world, but connecting it to their deen all the time. Like, may Allah preserve our sheikh, but he's a unique gem. And I remember sending Imam Umar a picture of my son during Ramadan, like a few years ago, where, you know, he's sitting with his iPad with Imam Umar speaking about, I think it was to do with Al-Aqsa maybe, but it could have been another topic. But he's got his headphones on, he's got it plugged in, and he's sitting there with the Ben & Jerry's by himself. Like, I think he's like 9 years old at the time.
Ben & Jerry's good ice cream.
Yeah,
well.
right. So like you know, it was such a cute picture in many ways, but I was just like, this is what we want. This is what we want our kids to be, this is how we want them to be learning.
Yeah.
But there are so many different resources. You know, they can learn through people like Loki, you know, watching his interviews, for instance. They can read books. My kids, alhamdulillah, they're a little bit like me. One of my sons says that he reads more than I do. So, you know, we haven't tested it yet, but they're all big readers. But because they were embarking on that reading journey, and the question that I had to myself is, okay, well, how can I introduce them to my world in a way that is staged? So, for example, one of the early books that they read is Betty Before X by Ilyasa Shabazz. And it's actually about Betty Shabazz, the wife of Malcolm X, and her childhood. But it's written for really small children, but you get introduced to the concepts of like racism and racial segregation and discrimination without it like smacking you on the nose with the big fat hammer. And, you know, you can read graphic novels like Mouse, for instance, which kind of teaches about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust in a very, very clever graphic novel way, which, you know, my kids really benefited from in terms of understanding how fascism works and operates and how you can end up with something like the Holocaust. There's a brilliant, I've forgotten its name now, there was a brilliant graphic novel on Syria and the Syria refugee crisis. And again, you know, came at the perfect time. It was a perfect tool for me to use to help explain to my children why are there Syrian refugees coming to the country? Why are these politicians that you're seeing on the media demonizing Syrian refugees? What's going on here? Where does it stem from? Yeah. And of course, some of this stuff is a bit liberal. And the takes are quite liberal, and so you have to kind of help them navigate the politics of what they're reading as well. They used to subscribe to a magazine, a kids magazine as well, political magazine. Again, very, very liberal magazine, but they'd read it. And the conversations that we'd have coming out of it were, for me, sometimes the most interesting aspect of their reading process, because it's not, you know, we're all human beings, we're all absorbing material all the time.
Yeah.
But it's so important, and I'm probably still not very good at doing this enough, which is it's the conversation you have after the input has been received, right? It's not just about giving them literature and just saying, fend for yourself in the world now. It's about, okay, fine, you read this. What does this mean for you in your life? Like, how did you understand it? What does it mean in your cosmology of your relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of your relationship to this ummah? And so part of it is trying to readjust the notions of what it means to have heroes in our lives. You know, and I always hold back Malcolm X's autobiography. I mean, you have to hold it back a little bit because the first is, you know, we've discussed before, the first part of the book, you know, is can be a bit troubling for younger readers. But, you know, by the time that they're 16, this is a book that they should be working their way up to, so that when they read it, you know, this book that had, I think, for most of us, such a profound political impact on our lives, is one that they're able to then kind of relate to more closely as well themselves. And so, you know, there's no, you know, I don't say to anybody there's a prescription for any of this. It's more about a process, right? About making sure that at various stages you're giving your children material that they can engage with, that they can think about, that they can be critical in their understanding of the world and the interactions that they're having with other people too.
Foreign trips. So many of Muslims in Britain take their kids to Dubai, because Dubai is a halal place to go and enjoy oneself and eat halal food and whatever, right? Which, you know, we can talk about the problems with that, but of course there isn't much learning when it comes to your, you know, this sort of political justice, thinking about the ummah. Give us some tips on where to take kids.
I mean, honestly, we haven't traveled that much together as a family. You know, we've been to Istanbul, and mashallah, you're a regular guest of yours on here, Yaqub Hoja. He has been kind enough to give my family a guided tour of the city.
That's more than I got. That's great.
which was really incredible. And, you know, the kids really benefited from that a lot. Yeah. My family, my kids, my wife, they went on Umrah recently, and it was an interesting experience for them. I wasn't able to go because, perhaps I'm persona non grata there, but it was so fascinating that you had to remind them that that land is a waqf for Muslims. And it's quite hard to envisage what that means, because you have border agents and you have Saudi police and you have military and you have checkpoints and you have visas and you have all of this. And all of that is constructed in a way to reinforce that there is Saudi Arabia, there is the rest of the world, and it's by their grace that you are permitted into this land. And, one of the most important conversations that I had with them before and during their travel and afterwards was trying to remind them that that land is a waqf for all of us, that no one has the ability or the right, at least, to stop you when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has invited you, to claim that you are an outsider to a place that is your spiritual home. And cognitively, it's very hard to do that, because the physical manifestations of bordering and control and policing and everything else, of course, gives the impression that that is a land that belongs to others. But that is simply not true, and it is not the case that anyone has the right. Now, if they are denying you that right, if they are inhibiting you and your right, that is a sin on them. And you've done your bit, which is to try and attempt to go there and to do the things that you need to do. But it is important that cognitively our children understand that they are connected to that land by virtue of the Prophet ﷺ and by virtue of their relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they have a right to be there, that they have a right to move there if they wanted to, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows a political environment one day when that's possible. Okay?
Yeah.
But you have to embed that. Otherwise, we go through life with this colonized mentality of, this world is split in the way that it is. Like, I even remind my kids, we lived in Egypt for a while. And, just recently I was talking to them about the fact that Umar ibn Khattab left Egypt as a waqf for the Muslim ummah, not for the Egyptian people. And that's so important for us to think about, because it talks about what is our relationship to the land? What is our relationship to all of these lands? What is our relationship to one another? And it cannot be that hatta al-yawm al-qiyamah, until the end of time, that this bordering that exists in the way that it does now, that this is Allah's final intention for this earth, for us as Muslims, that this was the final form of what the perfection of being a Muslim in the world looked like. It cannot be that. So even like, inshallah, hopefully, maybe if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us one day, I hope to take my kids to Bosnia, maybe to learn about a genocide that happened pretty much on our doorstep. That was only a couple of hours flight away from us, about what happened to the people there when they just looked like every other European. As somebody who's traveled to Bosnia, you walk around there and you're like, these are all white people. Like, it's like, it's cognitively, it's so difficult to understand how racism in that way, Islamophobia in that way, operated to permit a genocide to take place. But it did, and it happened in our lifetimes.
And I think I've got a world exclusive. You're writing a novel, are you, for young adults? Tell us a little bit about
Inshallah, bitawfiq, a new publishing house called Quillspire, they've taken on a novella. So it's a short book, but inshallah it's going to be around the hadith of the man that killed 100 people and was still forgiven by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Kind of use that as a device in order to create a fictional world, to really think about, especially through my work, why does violence happen? And is it possible that somebody might commit 100 murders but still have something inside them that is worth forgiving by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And I think sometimes we concentrate on the aspect of that hadith which is to do with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's forgiveness, but we forget the bit where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only forgives those who have something that is forgivable. And so what is it about the world that we live in where violence is such a natural part of human behavior, a terrible but natural part of human behavior? Could we understand that violence within like specific contexts? So I try and leverage much of the world that I've witnessed into the pages of the book, into the characters that I've made up in this kind of fictional world. Obviously, it's nothing to do with the hadith in terms of the world that I've made, but inshallah, hopefully, it's a way of helping young people to understand how cycles of repression, of cycles of trauma, cycles of violence, ultimately create worlds that are unjust. And in order to stop those cycles of violence, we actually have to have more justice in the world. Bi-idhni ta'ala.
Alhamdulillah. Dr. Asim Qureshi, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time today. Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.